The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air itself is holding its breath. All eyes were on the young girl sitting in the front row, her shoulders squared, her chin held high. She couldn't have been more than Dewey, but there was something about her, something unshakable. Her dark curls framed her face, and her eyes, sharp and unwavering, seemed to see right through the polished wood of the judge's bench, through the badges on the officers' chests, through the very walls of the room. She didn't look like someone who belonged in a place like this, and yet here she was, sitting quietly as the officers exchanged smirks, their voices dripping with condescension. "You think you're tough, huh?" One of them sneered, leaning in a little too close. "You're just a kid. You don't know how the real world works." The girl didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. But if they had been paying attention, really paying attention, they might have noticed the faintest flicker of something in her expression. Something dangerous. Something they weren't ready for. The officers had no idea who they were dealing with. To them, she was just another face in the system, another name on a docket. They didn't know about the late-night phone calls she'd taken in her small apartment, the ones where the voice on the other end spoke in hushed tones about policy, changes, about national security, about things that could change the course of history. They didn't know about the meetings she'd attended in rooms with no windows, rooms where the air smelled like power, and the walls seemed to hum with secrets. They didn't know that this girl, this so-called kid, had the ear of some of the most influential people in the country. They didn't know she was a White House insider. It had started as a simple misunderstanding, the kind of thing that happens every day. A traffic stop, a broken taillight. But then it had escalated, quickly. The officers had been aggressive. From the start, their voices sharp, their hands hovering near their belts like they were just waiting for an excuse. She'd stayed calm, her voice steady as she explained that she hadn't done anything wrong, but they hadn't listened. Instead, they'd cuffed her, shoved her into the back of their squad car and brought her here to this cold, sterile room where the walls seemed to close in with every passing second. And now, as she sat there, listening to them mock her, she felt something shift inside her. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about something bigger, something deeper. The judge cleared his throat, his glasses perched low on his nose as he glanced at the paperwork in front of him. "Miss Johnson," he began, his voice slow and deliberate, "you've been charged with resisting arrest and disorderly conduct. How do you plead?" The room seemed to hold its breath again, waiting for her answer. But before she could speak, one of the officers cut in. "Your Honor," he said, his tone dripping with false respect. "This girl's been nothing but trouble from the start. She thinks she's above the law, thinks she can talk her way out of anything." The judge raised an eyebrow, his gaze shifting back to the girl. "Is that so?" he asked, his voice tinged with skepticism. The girl took a deep breath, her eyes locking with his. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and strong, "I think there's been a misunderstanding, and I think it's time to clear it up." The room fell silent again, the tension so thick you could almost taste it. The officers exchanged glances, their smirks fading just a little. The judge leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. "And how do you propose we do that?" he asked. The girl reached into her bag, pulling out a small, unassuming folder. She placed it on the table in front of her, her fingers resting lightly on the cover. "I think this will explain everything," she said, her voice calm but firm. The judge hesitated for a moment, then nodded to the bailiff who stepped forward to take the folder. As he opened it, his eyes widened, and he quickly handed it to the judge. The room seemed to hold its breath once more as the judge began to read, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. The officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their confidence wavering. And the girl? She just sat there, her gaze steady, her lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. She knew what was coming next, and so did they. But before the judge could say another word, before the officers could even begin to process what was happening, the doors at the back of the courtroom burst open. A man in a dark suit strode in, his face grim, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on the girl, "Miss Johnson," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "We need to talk. Now." The girl stood, her movements slow and deliberate, her eyes never leaving the man's face. The officers exchanged panicked glances, their bravado crumbling as they realized just how badly they'd underestimated her. The judge looked up from the folder, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice shaking. But the girl didn't answer. She just turned and followed the man out of the room, leaving behind a stunned silence and 1,000 unanswered questions. The officers sat frozen, their minds racing as they tried to piece together what had just happened. And the judge. He just stared at the folder in his hands, his heart pounding as he realized one thing. This wasn't over. Not even close. The man in the dark suit led the girl, Miss Johnson, down a narrow hallway, his footsteps echoing against the polished floors. She followed without a word, her mind racing but her expression calm. She'd been in situations like this before, though. Never quite so public. The man didn't speak until they reached a small, windowless room at the end of the hall. He held the door open for her, his eyes scanning the hallway one last time before he stepped inside and closed the door behind them. The room was dimly lit, the only sound the faint hum of the air conditioner. He turned to her, his face serious. "Do you have any idea how much trouble you've just caused?" he asked, his voice low but urgent. She met his gaze, unflinching. "I didn't start this," she said simply, "but I'm going to finish it." The man sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You know how this looks," he said. "A White House intern, someone with access to classified information, getting arrested? Do you have any idea what the media would do with that?" She crossed her arms, her expression hardening. "I'm not just an intern," she said, "and you know it. This isn't about me. This is about what happened out there. Those officers, they think they can do whatever they want, to whoever they want, and if I don't do something about it, who will?" The man hesitated, his jaw tightening. He knew she was right. He'd seen the reports, heard the stories, but he also knew the risks. "You're playing with fire," he said finally. "And if you're not careful, you're going to get burned." She nodded, her resolve unwavering. "Then I'll get burned," she said. "But I'm not backing down." Back in the courtroom, the tension was still thick. The officers sat in stunned silence, their earlier confidence replaced by a growing sense of unease. The judge, meanwhile, was still staring at the folder the girl had left behind. The documents inside were unlike anything he'd ever seen. Official White House letterhead, signed by some of the highest-ranking officials in the country. There were notes, memos, even a few photographs. And at the center of it all was the girl, Miss Johnson. Her face stared back at him from one of the photos, standing beside the president himself, her expression calm but determined. The judge felt a chill run down his spine. He'd been on the bench for over 20 years, but he'd never seen anything like this. He closed the folder slowly, his mind racing. What had he just gotten himself into? Outside the courthouse, the man in the dark suit was already on the phone, his voice tense. "We've got a situation," he said. "It's the Johnson girl. She's making waves." There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by a low curse. "How bad is it?" the voice asked. The man glanced at the girl who was standing a few feet away, her arms crossed as she stared out at the city skyline. "Bad," he said. "She's got evidence, and she's not afraid to use it." There was another pause, longer this time. "Keep her quiet," the voice said finally. "Whatever it takes." The man nodded, though he knew it wouldn't be that simple. The girl wasn't the type to be kept quiet. She never had been. As the man ended the call, the girl turned to him, her eyes sharp. "Who was that?" she asked. He hesitated, then shook his head. "You don't need to know," he said. She raised an eyebrow, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "You're not very good at this, are you?" she said. He frowned, confused. "Good at what?" he asked. "Lying," she said simply. He opened his mouth to respond, but she cut him off. "I know who you're talking to," she said, "and I know what they want." but it's not going to work. I'm not going. To just sit back and let this happen. The man sighed, running a hand over his face. You don't understand, he said. This isn't just about you. There are bigger things at play here. Things you can't even imagine. She took a step closer, her gaze steady. Then make me understand, she said. Because right now, all I see is a system that's broken, and if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. The man stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded. All right, he said, but you're not going to like what you hear. She shrugged. I didn't expect to, she said. He took a deep breath, then began to explain. He told her about the meetings, the deals, the secrets that were kept hidden from the public. He told her about the people in power, the ones who pulled the strings behind the scenes. And he told her about the risks, the very real, very dangerous risks of trying to take them on. She listened in silence, her expression never changing. When he was finished, she nodded slowly. I see, she said. So, it's worse than I thought. He frowned. That's it? He asked. That's all you have to say? She met his gaze, her eyes blazing with determination. No, she said, that's not all, but it's a start. Meanwhile, back at the courthouse, the officers were starting to panic. They'd been sitting in silence for what felt like hours, their minds racing as they tried to piece together what had just happened. One of them, the one who'd been the most vocal earlier, finally broke the silence. What the hell was that? He asked, his voice shaking. The others shook their heads, their faces pale. I don't know, one of them said. But it's bad, really bad. The first officer cursed under his breath, running a hand through his hair. We need to figure this out, he said, before it's too late. But none of them had any idea where to start. The girl had left them with more questions than answers, and the folder she'd given the judge was like a ticking time bomb, just waiting to go off. As the hours passed, the tension in the courthouse only grew. The judge had retreated to his chambers, the folder still clutched in his hands. He'd tried to call a few contacts to get some answers, but no one was talking. It was as if the entire world had gone silent, holding its breath as it waited to see what would happen next. And the girl? She was still out there somewhere, her next move a mystery. The officers, the judge, even the man in the dark suit, they were all just pieces on a board, and she was the one holding the pieces. The question was, what was she going to do with them? The man in the dark suit had tried to convince her to lay low, to let him handle things, but she'd refused. This isn't just about me, she'd said. This is about everyone who's ever been treated like they don't matter, and I'm not going to stop until something changes. He'd tried to argue, to make her see reason, but he knew it was no use. She was determined, and once she set her mind to something, there was no stopping her. All he could do now was wait, and hope that she knew what she was doing. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the city, the girl stood on a rooftop looking out at the skyline. She had a plan, but it was risky. If it worked, it could change everything. If it didn't, well, she didn't want to think about that. She took a deep breath, her mind racing as she went over the details one last time. She knew the risks. She knew the stakes. But she also knew that she couldn't back down, not now, not ever. She pulled out her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen for a moment before she pressed send. The message was short, just a few words, but it was enough. It's time, she wrote. And then she waited, her heart pounding as she watched the city lights flicker to life. The game was on, and she was ready to play. The message sent, the girl, Miss Johnson, stood on the rooftop, the city light stretching out before her like a sea of stars. She knew what she'd just set in motion. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the officers who'd underestimated her, the system that had failed so many, and the people who'd been silenced for too long. She clenched her fists, feeling the weight of it all pressing down on her shoulders. But she didn't have time to second-guess herself. The wheels were already turning, and she had to stay ahead of them. Down below, the man in the dark suit was pacing in a dimly lit office. his phone buzzing incessantly. He ignored it for the most part, his mind racing as he tried to figure out his next move. He'd underestimated her too. And now he was paying the price. The people he answered to weren't happy, and their patience was wearing thin. He picked up the phone on the fifth ring, his voice tight. "I'm handling it," he said before the person on the other end could speak. There was a pause, then a cold, measured response. "You'd better, or you'll be the one taking the fall." The line went dead and he slammed the phone down, his jaw clenched. He'd always been good at cleaning up messes, but this was different. This girl wasn't just a loose end. She was a wildfire, and she was spreading fast. Meanwhile, the officers from the courtroom were huddled in a dingy bar on the outskirts of town, their nerves frayed. They'd been trying to piece together what had happened, but every lead seemed to hit a dead end. The one who'd been the most vocal earlier, Officer Daniels, was nursing a drink, his hands shaking slightly. "We need to find her," he said, his voice low, "before she ruins us." The others nodded, but none of them had any idea where to start. They'd tried calling their contacts, but no one was talking. It was like the girl had vanished into thin air. "What if she's got proof?" one of them asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Daniels shook his head, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to convince himself or the others. "She's just a kid," he said. "What could she possibly have?" But even as he said it, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were in way over their heads. Back at the courthouse, the judge was still in his chambers, the folder open on his desk. He'd been staring at it for hours, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The documents were damning, not just for the officers, but for the entire system. There were names, dates, even recordings, and at the center of it all was the girl. He didn't know how she'd gotten her hands on this information, but he knew one thing: it was explosive. If it got out, it would shake the city to its core. He picked up the phone, his hand trembling as he dialed a number. "We need to talk," he said when the person on the other end answered. "It's about the Johnson case." There was a long pause, then a sigh. "I'll be there in 10. The judge hung up, his heart pounding. He didn't know what was going to happen next, but he knew one thing. He was in way over his head. As the night wore on, the girl's message began to ripple through the city. It started small, a whisper here, a rumor there. But it didn't take long for it to spread. By midnight, it was all anyone could talk about. Social media was buzzing, news outlets were scrambling to verify the information, and the streets were alive with tension. People were angry, and they were looking for answers. The girl watched it all unfold from a safe house, her laptop open in front of her. She'd known this would happen, but seeing it in real time was something else entirely. She felt a pang of guilt. She hadn't wanted to put anyone in danger, but she knew it was necessary. Sometimes you had to tear something down to build it back up. The man in the dark suit was watching it all unfold too, but from a very different perspective. He'd been called into an emergency meeting with his superiors, and the mood was tense. "This is out of control," one of them said, slamming a hand on the table. "We need to contain it now." The man nodded, though he wasn't sure how. The girl had been careful, covering her tracks at every turn. She'd left them with no choice but to play her game, and they were losing. "What about the girl?" another one asked. "Can we bring her in?" The man shook his head. "She's too smart for that," he said. "And even if we could, it wouldn't stop this. The cat's out of the bag." There was a long silence, then a sigh. "Then we need to find another way," the first one said, "before it's too late." As the meeting dragged on, the girl was already thinking several steps ahead. She knew they'd come for her eventually, but she wasn't going to make it easy for them. She'd spent months preparing for this, gathering evidence, building alliances, and laying the groundwork for what was to come. She'd known it would be dangerous, but she'd also known it was necessary. The system was broken, and someone had to fix it. If that someone had to be her, then so be it. She closed her laptop, her mind racing as she went over the next steps. She had a plan, but it was risky. If it worked, it could change everything. If it didn't, well, she didn't want to think about that. The officers, meanwhile, were growing increasingly desperate. They'd tried to lay low, but it was getting harder and harder to stay off the radar. People were starting to ask questions, and the pressure was mounting. Daniels had tried to call in a few favors, but no one was willing to stick their neck out for him. "We're on our own," he said, his voice grim. The others nodded, though none of them had any idea what to do next. They'd always thought they were untouchable, but now they weren't so sure. As the first light of dawn broke over the city, the tension was palpable. The girl was still out there somewhere, her next move a mystery. The officers were scrambling, the man in the dark suit was trying to keep up, and the judge was caught in the middle, unsure of which way to turn. The city was on edge, waiting for the next shoe to drop. And the girl? She was just getting started. She knew the risks, but she also knew the stakes, and she wasn't going to stop until something changed. The question was, what would it cost her and everyone else to get there?